Great. Thank you, Deborah. That's great. Yeah. Thank you for those nice words of introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you on the East Coast. It's amazing how technology works, how we can be connected in this way. I want to thank Mayor Calloway for his leadership and invitation, as well as my colleague for being with you guys. I want to be able to share my screen, so I will do that now. And in doing so, I am revealing a part of my family before my wife and my 3 daughters, probably you're seeing. So that's a little bit more background about what's important to me, my family. You'll probably see that in my background behind me as well. And so thank you for this time. I want to know as we get started today that our time here, while I'm grateful for the time we have, is really just a starting point to a conversation, and it builds on the work that's already happening with the State League and its commitment to equity. And so I appreciated Deborah's comments because she really started to name the moment that we're in. And I kind of want to bring that into the space a little bit more. And so I want to play this short video that I think really provided some of that compelling framing.
Please, I can't breathe shit.
Why is a black life any more recoupable than a white life?
Let it be known wherever we go that all of us should be free and equal and have all opportunities that others should have.
I am the people. I'm not the pig. You got to make a distinction. And the people are going to have to attack the pigs. The people are going to have to stand up against the pigs.
So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy.
I'm tired of my black men and my black women being shot, being killed by the NYPD.
For hundreds of years, black people and people of colour be absolutely abused and killed on the streets, and it's just getting worse and worse. We've had enough, and if they're not going to listen, we're going to scream louder and louder, and we're not going to stop until something is done. We've had enough. This is people who have had enough. It's time to make some change.
So I thought that 3-minute clip brought into the room what all of us have been seeing for the last 2 months. Obviously, more than 2 months it's been happening in our country, but in the last 2 months, the presence of so many voices across this country and across the state of Oregon, and over 1,000 cities, towns, and villages, cities speaking up about having enough, sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that tension is at the doorsteps of cities, you as city leaders. And how are you responding to this rising tension? And that's, for me, I think, a really important backdrop, while also naming, as you heard from Deborah as well, as we talk about now, over 5 million cases of the coronavirus, almost over 150,000 deaths, and then the disparities that we're seeing as it relates to the impact of that across our country and in the state. And so one of the for me, doing this work, it's really important to name what the work is, and finding different ways to be able to do that. This quote from the late Dr. Maya Angelou, I thought did a wonderful job naming the moment. I wanted to bring that into our space together. Her quote, "Prejudice is a burden that confuses the past. It threatens the future and renders the present inaccessible." What I love about this quote is she's calling to task, what moment are we in? Our inability to call out and talk explicitly about what we're facing as a country will paralyze us. It will paralyze, it has confused our past, it is paralyzing us in our present, and it renders our future, finding ourselves coming back to this 5, 10, 50 years from now. And so what's the work that we can do as leaders, city leaders in our communities, that is committed to moving this work further, where we're not finding ourselves coming back to this same challenge? And so that's the journey. What's the journey to not just prevent further conflict? When we started REAL 6 years ago, it was with the backdrop of Ferguson. Ferguson is a member of the National League of Cities. They reached out to us 6 years ago as they were facing, and we all were seeing what was happening to Ferguson and the tensions. We at the National League of Cities did not have good guidance at the time. REAL wasn't created. We weren't doing a lot in the race and social justice space. But we obviously said, don't do what you're doing. Tanks on the streets, not the best way of really responding. But there were a lot more cities after Ferguson that were saying, well, help us not become a Ferguson. And what we're hearing now, after the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, et cetera, from city leaders is not, we don't want to prevent becoming another Ferguson. Help us to lead in this space. What does it mean to lead? What's our voice as leaders in this space, and what can we do to support you in that? And so that is why REAL was created. It was created with that focus of you in mind, our ability to strengthen your knowledge, your capacity, to understand your role in eliminating racial disparities, heal racial tensions, and build more equitable communities. So that's our mission. That's been driving us in the work we do and the tools and the resources and what we offer. And so there's a range of things we offer, from trainings. Again, this is not a form of a training. This is like an introduction, if you will, to a training. We're kind of laying the foundation. We do a number of things with cities around capacity building, technical assistance, networking, where you're connecting with your colleagues across the state, across the country, and also recognizing the intersections around different special populations. So not going to go into depth of all of the services we provide, but want you to know that in the last 6 years, the NLC has built out and continues to build the resources that we hope continue to be useful for cities across the country. And what I can share with you is the presence of REAL in our network. So literally across the country, we have now engaged in over 400 cities, towns, and villages. We have now engaged over 700 city leaders through our trainings and capacity building and technical assistance. Not seeing as many dots on that in the state of Oregon, but we're working on that, Mike. Right? We're going to increase those dots as well. As you can see, a few where we've been doing some good work. And I do think this moment really is calling for those opportunities to be able to go deeper. But while I show you these dots, I also want to acknowledge that while there is such a stronger presence of city leaders in the last 6 years that have been stepping up and saying that they want to lead, understanding what their voice is, and of all sizes, I also want to emphasize that there is not one city that has figured this out. There's not one model that's out there that says, if you do it just like Seattle, you'd be great. If you do it just like Madison, Wisconsin, you'll be great. No, that's not where we are. We are, as across this country, building a foundation for really figuring out what does transformational change look like. And that's the journey I think we all collectively are on. I just want to name that because I know as leaders you're looking for, just tell me what to do, give me the solutions, we'll run with it. And we're not in that space as a country or even in the work that's happening locally on the ground. And so in building this work, we have had really important partners that have been helpful. One of those partners I wanted to acknowledge, a shout out to them, is our Race Forward, our folks at Government Alliance for Race and Equity. It's really important for us not to reinvent the wheel, and so we have been very intentional about that in how we've been developing our tools and our resources to help cities. And it's within that space that where I want to spend the time with you, right, which is really talking about a framework where we go a lot deeper in around each of these components. I'll spend some time within each just to give you a flavor of the framework around how do you normalize a conversation on racial equity? What does that look like? Then how do you then operationalize it? What are the tools and data that you need to use that really help you drive change? And then how do you organize? What needs to happen within government? What needs to happen in partnership with the community? What infrastructures need to be in place, et cetera. So I want to give you a flavor of all three. Most of the time here will be on the normalizing space because that's a really foundational piece before you start using tools and before you start thinking about how you get organized. But I want to start off with you understanding what the framework is before we start jump in, if we will, to the normalizing space. And as we get started, I do want to say if there are things that I'm saying where you feel like you have questions and don't feel like you have to wait until the end. I appreciate Mayor Calloway offering to kind of monitor the chat room. And so he has offered to flag for me as I'm presenting if there are questions that are happening that you have, that he'll interrupt, and it's not a problem. I'm happy to stop if there are specific questions to try to respond in real time. So I just wanted to say that before I start jumping in and sharing some more content. So I want to start first on the normalizing front around why we prioritize race, because that's really critical. When we launched REAL 6 years ago, we had our first real talk. I'm not sure if Mike was there or any of you were there. I did see Mayor Doyle there. I remember Mayor Doyle being in the room. We had about 400 or 500 elected officials at our conference in D.C. here in March. And the real talk was, it was great. We were launching, wanted to talk about NLC being committed to doing this work. And we were very intentional. It's called REAL, race, equity, and leadership. So we were intentional about calling out race, but we were also intentional, as you heard from Deborah, acknowledging kind of equity, the broader issues of equity, as well as the importance of leadership, of local leadership. So when we had that first real talk, it was a mess. I'm just going to say 6 years ago, everybody was talking about everything and nothing all at the same time. It's like, oh my goodness, where is this going? And so we literally found ourselves needing to take a step back, reassess kind of where we were going and how we prioritize. What does that look like for our organization to support cities in doing this work? And so the question of where do we start was really at the center of that in our conversations. And it was in those conversations, the conversation about why we lead with race was so important. And so one of the aspects that led us there was a range of conversations we were having with folks doing this work, again, in the space of not reinventing the wheel, that helped us understand the data. When you look at the data, whether we're talking about infant mortality to life expectancy, race is still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country. Holding everything else constant, race is still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country. And that was a lot to sit with. To hear that from the data, there are so many different aspects of understanding that. Obviously, in this presentation, I'm not able to break that down in all aspects, but I do want to name some of that. And this was one of those to bring that into the room. This was one study that was done by the Center for Disease Control a few years ago, looking at maternal mortality rates of women. And so they did exactly that. As they were looking at maternal mortality rates, they controlled for everything in a woman's background, except for the woman's race. They controlled for how much money she made, where she lived, her education. And as they controlled for that, they still found that black women had 2 to 3 times higher rates of maternal mortality, right? Controlling for everything else, right? And so it wasn't just talking about maternal mortalities where we found that. It was looking at a range of other issues, whether we were looking at the criminal justice system, what we were finding, whether we were looking at the education system, workforce, unemployment, housing, controlling, still leading us back to that same conclusion, right? And so what was important was 2 things to kind of acknowledge. When we were talking about race, we weren't just talking about black and white, right? When we're saying race is still the strongest predictor of one's success, it's not our default just talking about black and white. Yes, there's some clear disparities between black and white, but you also have to dig much deeper in doing this work. You have to look at it from the Latinx community. You have to look at it from our indigenous communities. And you have to look at it from particularly unpacking our sub-Asian Pacific Islander communities, because looking at API, Asian Pacific Islanders in the aggregate, is also can also tell a narrative that's not completely accurate. And so there's a lot of work on the data front that really drew us to that space. But then the second point is also really important, that while race is still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country, it doesn't mean that you still don't need to understand the intersectionalities of other issues, right? And so it's not race or LGBTQ. It's not race or poverty. It's not race or education, race or housing. It's and, right? And so it's understanding race is still the strongest predictor of one's success, while also holding the intersectionalities of the conversations, which is we can't talk about housing, or we can't talk about LGBTQ issues, or we can't talk about women issues, or we can't talk about unemployment without centering race in the conversation. Because if we don't, what we tend to do is see an exacerbation of the inequities, right? And so that was what was so important to really understand as we were naming in that normalizing space racial equity. Again, if we know race is the strongest predictor of one's success, then our goal, racial equity, this is to close the gaps where race no longer predicts one's success in this country while improving outcomes for everyone. Both are important to the definition of racial equity. Our goal is, if we know the data is leading us here, we know the data continues to show race is the strongest predictor, we as leaders don't want to see that. We want to close the gaps where race is not always being the predictor, but we also want to see outcomes improve for everyone. And so as we hold both as the definition of racial equity, then racial equity then is about targeting. How are we targeting our strategies? How are we targeting what is referred to as targeted universalism? How are we targeted in our process but universal in our goals? And working to get to the root causes of why. Why is it that race is still the strongest predictor of one's success? Why is it that in the case of maternal mortality rates, Black women are still disproportionately dying from maternal mortality rates regardless of how much money they make, regardless of how much education they have, regardless of where they live? Why are we still seeing that? What's at the root of that? And that's the work, right, of being able to be targeted and to also be willing to get to the root causes, while also knowing by doing that, it's ultimately to see outcomes improve for all. And in that definition, the space that really resonated with me that I wanted to share with you, that I hope also resonates with you, is this terminology called the curb effect. Not sure if you've heard about the curb effect, but if you think about the work that was happened during the American Disabilities Act over 25 years ago, there was the advocacy around the American Disabilities Act was to really address better public access space for people with disabilities. And so there was a number of things that came out of the American Disabilities Act that created better public access space for people with disabilities, from elevator usage, buildings needing to have elevators if you had floors higher than more than 3 floors, to curbs and ramps, right? And so the curb cut effect was an example of that. So the American Disabilities Act is why we see so many of these curb cuts off these sidewalks, right? And so the design of that policy was to be targeted towards to be helpful for people with disabilities. But then who else benefited from the curb cuts, right? Everyone who uses them. If you have children, if you're pushing kids in their strollers, if you are with your suitcase and you're pulling your suitcase and you're going to heading to wherever you're heading to, or if you are biking on your bike and you're going from sidewalk to sidewalk, right? There are larger benefits for being targeted in the impact of the American Disabilities Act. So I hope that example kind of again helps shed light on both understanding the definition of racial equity while also understanding the need to be targeted. And so it was in that space when we launched that we were on this journey of figuring out how then do we name this? What does it mean to name this? What does that work look like in naming it? And so one of our first real talks was at the museum in Washington, D.C. We had a panel discussion with our CEO, Clarence Anthony, as you see here, our two past presidents, Councilmember Matt Zone and former Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson, and Tim Wise, who served on our Real Board of Advisors. You can see the full clip on our website, but I wanted to play the opening of it that really named and challenged us 6 years ago as we were launching this.
Tim, you have written a book about this subject from a different perspective. What are your thoughts, opening thoughts about where we are in America right now?
Well, in the 3 minutes, 3 to 5 that we've been given, I'll do my best to answer it. And I know we're going to get deeper into this conversation as we go, so I'll save some of what I want to talk about for that. But I really appreciate the way that you framed the discussion at the outset, because at least on 2 occasions I heard you reference something that we really don't do very much in this country, and that is you referenced systemic racism, and you referred to it in that way. And I think that's important. In fact, it's critical, not just for the National League of Cities effort, but for our conversation as a country, because too often what we do, and I think we all know this, is we look at racism as that thing that happened in Charleston. That is to say, and when I say that thing that happened, I'm not talking about the generations of institutional racism. I'm talking about the thing that happened this summer. We look at that as racism. We say, well, Dylan Roof walks into a church and massacres 9 people, and the city comes together, and the state comes together, and the country grieves, and that's racism. And then we sort of wash our hands of it because we say, well, thankfully, that doesn't happen every week. That doesn't happen all the time. That's an anomaly. But we have to be prepared to look at racism as something that's far deeper than that, and not about bigotry, not about overt hatred, and not just about that type of random retail violence, because that's retail violence. We got wholesale violence. And by that, I mean, if you're going to understand what happened in Baltimore in the last 6 months, you cannot start with Freddie Gray, and you cannot start even with the police department in Baltimore. You have to start with the fact that that is a community that was wrecked by so-called urban renewal. That was violence. When they come in and they put the interstate through your community, and they knock down your business, and they knock down your apartments, and they make folks huddle into small crowded housing, and they essentially lock them in a holding pen. I mean, we talk about housing and education. We talk about neighborhoods as if it's not about racism. We act like folks just ended up where they ended up. But let's be clear, this thing that we in this country call the ghetto, that was created. And it wasn't created by black people, and it wasn't created by poor people. It was created by folks who were usually not black and definitely not poor as a holding pen for the people they didn't want to live amongst them. So we have to be prepared to call that violence. If you don't call zoning laws and redlining violence, even though it does violence, and you don't call it racism, then how are we going to solve that? So I want us to frame this conversation the way that you've done it. And I think that's where we are as a country. We're still stuck in this mode of describing racism as this interpersonal thing rather than understanding it structurally and institutionally. And I think until we get to that place where we can talk about not just that individual cop who does something wrong in the community, which we can see plenty of examples of that, but until we deal with the mentality that says that spatial isolation, segregation, residential isolation, black and brown kids going to schools 12 times more likely to be places of concentrated poverty. That's not an accident. People didn't choose that. And so I think that's where we need to go, is to frame the conversation in a way that reminds us that we're talking about systemic and structural violence. And we can't just talk about the sort of retail level stuff, as important as that is, and as horrific as a hate crime is. To be really honest, at the risk of being hyperbolic, aspects of this country's history have been an intergenerational hate crime against certain people. And that's just the truth. We don't like to use language like that. Sounds un-American, unpatriotic, whatever kind of terminology we use, but that's real. And unless we're prepared to do it that way and have that conversation that way, I'm afraid we'll keep spinning our wheels, coming back, having the same conversations over and over and over again. The reason that low-income black folks were the ones hit hardest in New Orleans was not an accident. And what was stunning to me about it, and I lived there for 10 years, the only people that were shocked by what happened, for the most part, were white folks. Black folks weren't shocked that they got uprooted. They weren't shocked that they got left behind and forgotten. That was the history of that community, right? Urban renewal did that. Interstate highway construction right through the Treme, the oldest free black neighborhood in this country, did that. And so it was just same thing, different day. A little bit more extreme, and the cameras were on, and they made movies about it. But it was the same stuff that had always been happening. So we have to go back to that systemic understanding, which is something I think the movement historically knew, but most of our leaders have sometimes forgotten.
Wow. So we're going to have a real conversation today, aren't we? I think I'm ready. I think I'm ready.
Anyone knows Clarence, he's rarely speechless. So that was one of those rare moments that I could catch on camera where he was not ready, and neither was I 6 years ago. What Tim Wise just said in 3.5 minutes made me very uncomfortable in that room six years ago. There was a lot of ouch, and that was just the beginning of the conversation. It was a 90-minute discussion. Again, you can watch the whole thing on our website. It's gotten the most views that NLC has gotten on any video. We're over 60,000 views of that dialogue that we had. It did tell us that we needed to figure out how to help elected leaders, mayors, understand what Tim Wise just said in 3.5 minutes, and do it in a way where obviously there will be spaces of discomfort, but help them unpack everything. He said so many different things in 3.5 minutes there. And I was like, wow, that's the journey we're on. And so while this is not a training for me to fully unpack, part 2 of my normalizing is to try to unpack some of that language, right? Because he named a few things, and I think it's important to be able to sit with and be willing to build on that as a foundation. And so one of the things that I think is really important to name as a starting point is the differences between equity and equality. For any of us that have been in this space, you have seen a version of these diagrams, right? 3 people trying to watch a game from behind the fence, and equality is giving them all 3 the same thing. But equity is asking the question, what do they need if the goal is to watch the game from behind the fence? And so the person on the left who doesn't need anything can watch the game just fine from behind the fence without anything. The person in the middle needs 2 boxes to be able to watch the game from behind the fence. And the person on the right needs a ramp to be able to watch the game from behind the fence. So equity is asking what people need. Equality is giving them the same thing. And in a normalizing space, and just think about yourself, think about your residents, thinking about your staff, people have different starting points in understanding equity versus equality. The intent of the simplicity of the slide is for people to know that these are 2 separate words. If we're going to grow, we can't be using the word equality when we're talking about equity, right? And how do you help someone understand the differences? Like, oh, I get many times working with city leaders, this very simple chart as a very starting point is like, oh, this helps me understand the differences, right, between equality and equity. But you can't stop there, right? Because while it's important to understand the differences and you're not now using the words interchangeably, there's still much more nuance to understanding equity. There are a lot more questions that you need to ask yourself, right? While equality is about giving people the same thing, and equity is giving people what they need, you may not be asking the right questions as you're trying to give people what they need, right? There could be questions of, well, are they starting at the same space? You know, are they on different grounds, right? Is there something wrong with where they're starting from? Is there something wrong with the fence, right? That you need to be asking as you're asking questions around equity. You can go even further than that. You can ask, well, why are we setting the goal of them being behind the fence? How come they're not in the stands? How come they're not playing in the game? How come they are not owning the team, right? There are lots of questions that you can ask as you're really trying to understand the nuances of equity, right? And so I don't want to leave you at the place where, okay, I get equality and equity, and you figure now you can move forward, but wanting to also make sure we're leaving you in a place where understanding that it's nuanced and it's still work that you need to do to continue to strengthen and understand how you move forward with an equity agenda and understanding kind of its differences from equality, right? So that is kind of at a very high level, equality, equity in kind of a normalizing, naming that, right, that we hope is helpful. But we also want to name bias. The reason why we name bias is really centered as we talk about racial equity. It's at the center both as we understand it individually, us having bias, but also as we understand how bias shows up in our city, how it shows up in organizations, how it shows up in agencies, right? And so the important thing to name as we talk about bias is that first as a definition, bias is very simply, is about how we evaluate and associate one group as it relates to another group. It's just kind of our association of one group to another. And we all do it. It's an inescapable reality of humanity. We all make those associations, whether you realize it or not. It's just a part of who we are. And I want to spend a little time in that space naming that. But also acknowledging the reason why it's important to name it and call it out is that if you don't call it out, you're not doing the work that needs to happen, because it's the choices we make about how we let our bias influence our actions, particularly when it leads to negative or discriminatory outcomes for certain groups. And so we need to recognize not that we have bias, but that we do have it, and what's the work we need to do to hold ourselves accountable so it's not influencing us. And I call that out in particular because the bias that most of the space that we need to be dealing with is not in the explicit. It's not the bias that we're conscious about, not the things we know we don't like, right? You know, there might be certain things we don't like we're very explicit about, consciously about aware of our bias. There's maybe work we need to do on that, but but you're more aware of that. It's the implicit, the things that are you're more unaware of as we talk about our bias. It's the stuff that happens in what's referred to in the work, the unconscious mind, right? It's in that space where the research talks about how our brain functions, right? As we function where we organize things quickly into schemas, right? They call them in the research frames that we use to help quickly organize, sort things into categories, create associations, we try to quickly fill in the gaps. And the example that comes to mind to me, well, I guess it's like now 5 months ago, my last travel, I think it was out to New Orleans, and I had alligator for the first time. And I said, man, this thing tastes just like chicken, right? I put it right into my chicken category, right? All of us do some version of that, right, as we talk about our bias. And there's a lot more we do in a training to help understand it, both in a light way to understand it, but also recognizing how it's associated as we talk about it in a racial equity context. Because as we understand our bias, not that we don't have it, but we all have it, it's understanding how our bias has influenced us, how it is through the different places we have been influenced, we are exposed and socialized to certain groups. However we've grown up, we've been exposed and socialized to different racial groups, to different gender groups, to different religious groups. We've been all socialized by how we've grown up or how we've been influenced by media and other things that have exposed us. It's just a reality that you can't avoid. It's how we all have lived in this space. Everyone lives across the world. It's a human trait. Now, the challenge in the bias is that exposure to those groups and how then we pair that association unconsciously to characteristics, particularly those characteristics that don't necessarily align with the reality of that group, right? And specifically as we talk about racial equity and in the backdrop of what we're seeing is that direct implicit association that we have built in this country, we know from the research, between blacks, African Americans, and criminal activity. It's an association that has happened. We break that down a lot more further in understanding it. But it's important to name, if you're going to do this work, how it shows up in our practices and in our decision making. And so wanted to bring that into the room, hopefully in a way that kind of names that through this very short video. So I'm going to play this clip. pretty compelling video if you're able to see it. There's a lot that we could talk about. And again, this is not a training, so we would usually in our trainings, even in our virtual trainings that we do now, create spaces for some conversation and dialogue. But there's a lot of what did you pick up that you saw. The video is called The Look, sponsored by one of our partners, Procter & Gamble, but they have, they're putting out a lot of these messaging. And there was a lot of different looks that were playing out. As we talk about bias, in the space of understanding bias and its connections to racial equity. And so I named that because that's a really important, again, just bringing that into the space of normalizing. There's work you need to do to normalize a conversation there. Our inability to talk about it, again, the late Maya Angelou, we'll find ourselves coming back to this problem 5, 10, 50 years from now. So what's the work that needs to happen? While also recognizing as we understand bias in the context of racial equity, it is layered. It's not as simple as, as just understanding it's an inescapable reality of humanity, but understanding that bias shows up at individual levels, at an institutional level, in ourselves, within our staff, within city staff, within our community, but also within our city agencies and community organizations, and understanding it's layered in understanding how bias shows up. And so this chart, again, we spent a little more time in a training walking it through and helping people practice it, but wanted to just help you understand the layeredness of it, right? Understanding it when we talk about bias at the individual level is how it shows up implicitly and explicitly. At the institutional level, the same implicitly and explicitly. And so we had this was an exercise done by Seattle, a local police department. I said the name already, Seattle Police Department. They went through, as a police department, went through and tried to identify examples where they saw bias show up at each of these different levels. And so what you see here is them kind of naming that. So they thought that, and where it could, if they were trying to name where the definitions make sense. There still is obviously nuance in how they named it, but it was a helpful way to begin to understand the layerness of it as they're understanding bias within the police department. And so here they named individual implicit bias, those unconscious attitudes and beliefs, a police officer calling for backup more often when stopping a person of color, right? And there's obviously unconsciousness about it. There's obviously those that do it consciously, but that could be a space where you could see that happening more in the implicit space. The explicit is a police officer calling someone an ethnic slur, right? A clear explicit behavior, right, by a police officer, right? The institutional explicit are those policies that discriminate against a particular group. In this case, the police department refusing to hire someone of color. Now, the good news about institutional explicit, there is recourse in our laws and policies if those behaviors are happening. You can file lawsuits. There are things now we've done as a country where we've evolved, and we have recourse for those actions if that is happening. The challenge in the work, and the reason I went through it in that particular order, is this last piece, institutional implicit. It's the policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally that don't call out race. It doesn't call out a particular group, but your policies are having that negative impact, right? And in this case, they define police departments focusing on street-level drug arrests. I can kind of unpack how they got there. If you think about drug use or drug distribution in this country by race, and I was to ask you who uses drugs more, white people or people of color, how many folks would say white people? How many folks would say people of color? How many folks would say about the same? All right. That's right. It's about the same. It's about the same. What about drug distribution? Who distributes drugs more? White people? Hands up for white people? Or people of color? Or about the same? All right. So actually, data shows a little bit more white people, but it's like by a few percentage, by distributes drugs. But then the next question is, where do white people distribute drugs, and where do people of color distribute drugs? Right, and you start to unpack that, you find that where white people tend to distribute drugs are more in social settings, at parties, at their houses, in private spaces, right? And you have definitely a disproportionate more people of color distributing it in public settings, right? And so if you have a goal as a city that you want to address drug use in your city, but your only strategy is to target people that are street-level drug arrests, what will happen by your policy? You will disproportionately be targeting people of color because that's where they tend to distribute and/or use drugs, right? So just that's the police department in Seattle getting there, right? So that was their nuanced way of being able to unpack that, to understand that policy. And that policy does not name race, right? But it has a disproportionate impact when we talk about race. And so that work, the reason why I spent a little bit more time in that space is that's the work of training, right? That's the work of how do you operationalize tools and resources to help you begin to ask those kinds of questions. While the drug piece might be simple, and it may not be depending on how you process it, there are a lot more nuances to policy to be able to unpack the disproportionate impact of your policies, practices, and procedures. So I wanted to name that. Again, this is not a training, but I feel like I want to name a few things for you in this space as you're trying to understand it. And so the reason why I spent a little more time on bias is to understand as we talk about racial equity, bias is a really important aspect to understand in the context of this work. And particularly not to get to a space where you're not saying, well, I'm going to suppress and deny I have bias, because we know by doing that, that only increases or exacerbates inequities. But what can you do as city leaders to be more accountable individually about your bias, but also accountable about how bias shows up in your organizations or in the work you do within the community? What's the actions that you're willing to take? So naming equity, equality, bias might be uncomfortable. You might think it's hard to do, but it's even harder naming racism. Or it's even harder calling out racism, talking about systemic and structural racism, or even understanding what it is in the work that we do with city leaders. And you heard from the Tim Wise clip. He named a few things and spent a lot of time on saying a lot about it in his 3.5-minute clip. And what I wanted to be able to do is just at least provide some context to what we mean when we say racism. There's a lot more we do here in understanding it, but I want to acknowledge or build on what Tim said, because typically when people hear about racism, they tend to think about the individual acts. He mentioned Dylann Roof because when we were filming that Real Talk, it was right after Charleston, for those that remember Dylann Roof and Mother Bethel. But we tend to think of those individual acts. We think about Charlottesville, right? We think about the individual acts of racism, right? And what the work we do is not just understanding individual acts, first understanding individual acts in a larger system of racism, but understanding most importantly institutional and structural racism. And when you hear those terms, institutional and structural racism, I want to be able to just provide as much clear as possible the definition of what that means. Institutional racism means that there are policies, practices, procedures in this country that have been created that have benefited white people over communities of color. Whether it was intentional, sometimes it was intentional, or unintentional or inadvertently. That has happened in our institutions within government. Whether we are talking about our educational system, our transportation system, our housing system, there are policies that have existed. Some intentionally, some not intentionally. That's when you hear institutional racism is what is being articulated in some version. Again, people have different ranges of understanding that. Now, when you hear the term structural racism, it's acknowledging that those policies, practices, procedures that have benefited white people over communities of color has not just existed in one institution. It has existed in all of our institutions in government. It's existed across government. It was designed that way. And so structural racism is acknowledging all of our institutions have this problem, right? And so individual is one institution, structural is multiple institutions. And so I know I've said a whole lot, and that may be a lot to sit with. And so while this is, again, not a training, what I'd like to be able to do is at least bring some of that into the room to hopefully provide more context. And so this is a short clip from a documentary called The House We Live In. It's a 3-part series. I'm playing a short clip of part 3 of that series that I feel does a really good job of bringing into the room a better understanding of institutional and structural racism.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans, or the backing for loans, to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, an interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences. Very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So I hope that that short clip at least brings to life the definitions of institutional and structural racism, that there were policies, practices, procedures that benefited white people over communities of color. Some cases, in this case, intentionally, but other cases inadvertently. And that's really important to hold. I cannot begin to tell you, doing this work for the last 6 years, how much of a light bulb it is for local leaders to understand that, right? Understand, well, that, so many have heard of redlining, but you ask them, they go deeper, didn't realize what role government played, they didn't really understand the implications of redlining in their communities, the intentionality of how neighborhoods ended up the way they ended up, or even understanding redlining as we think about where we are today. And so one of the contracts we have is with the city of Denver. This map, as you can see here, looked at some of their redlining maps within the 1940s. And kind of where those areas were in their city that were redlined and those that were considered segregated from blacks that were green and yellow, that were considered more favorable. And then they looked at their current, relatively where that current population is right now in 2016, looking at those darker areas, again, aligning so closely to where the red areas were, and that darker area being where the higher percentage of their black and indigenous people of color are. And so the intentionality of where these neighborhoods are very much connected to policies, practices, procedures that were intentionally put in place that now maybe they're not there anymore, but the impacts, the inadvertent impacts of those policies that are having right now, who have access to what, how policies are then used around that. Right, and there's so much to unpack there. Again, this is not a training. I'm pulling myself back from not going deeper into the space, but just to be able to name, right, as we're normalizing. And so I know we spent most of our time here in the normalizing space, and it wasn't even a training, right? I just began to name some of the content, right? And it's really important, and then this is just with you. Now, how do you take this message and share it with your staff or with your colleagues on council or with your community? There is work that needs to happen. Like, you might walk away like, wow, there's stuff you've learned, and that's great, you want to be able to share it, but even this work is the journey. I'm just wanting to name that as I realize there's a lot of content that was shared in that normalizing space. While also recognizing, as I shared earlier, the framework is not just leaving you in the normalizing space. It's also helping you then to think, after you've begun to normalize, what do you do? What are tools that you can use that you begin to operationalize? And that operationalizing is really important because it's you as leaders, your goal here is to have a bigger impact. Your intent is not to see the disparities that exist in your communities. And so how then do you operationalize something that moves from your intent to something that's more impactful, something that's fairer and more just in that work? And so the operationalizing work, there's a lot of deeper work there, right, that we do, and both in terms of understanding how do you think about operationalizing it in your process, how do you understand it both individually, institutionally, but also how do you produce the tools and products that are needed as you're using that lens, right? And so both are important in how we operationalize. But I'm not going to obviously spend the time I have to go in deeper, but I just want to be able to name that while also sharing with you an example of a tool, right? And so like, you might be asking, well, what's a tool? What's a tool that's out there, right? And so these components serve as kind of a foundation to a tool, right? And as you can quickly pick up from the diagram, we center the voices of the community as we do work with city leaders. That's so important if you're going to do a racial equity tool. When we say the community, particularly the Black, Indigenous people of color, like how are their voices centered? in this work, as you are understanding the kind of results you want to be setting, understanding the data, who's been impacted, who's been burdened, who has been benefited from your policies, as you think differently about your implementation, how you hold yourself accountable, et cetera. And so this tool can be used in so many different places. It can be used as, this is kind of just a sample, if you will, of where it shows up. You could be looking at it from your contracting policies, to your zoning policies, to your fines and fees, to even your public spaces and recreational spaces. There are so many, and these are just a sample. You could look at it from your hiring, recruitment. I mean, there's a lot of places that it shows up literally across your city. And then the question is, what's the work that needs to happen that gets you to start using the tool? What you can't do, even if you're committed to wanting to move this work forward, we have seen cities struggle when they go straight to wanting to use the tool, and you give it to your staff and say, we got to use this tool, and you haven't done any normalizing yet. You got to do the normalizing work before you start saying, take this tool and start using it, right? And so really important just to name that as we're talking about operationalizing. And so that's just a quick crash course on operationalizing. We go much deeper into operationalizing when we do the work with cities, or even if we do training. But then the final piece I wanted to get, as I mentioned, is give you a sense of is then how do you then start getting organized? If you are doing this work as a leader, what can you do as a leader, or what can you and your council do? And so that's one of the first tools we put out several years ago for city leaders. I want to encourage you in the follow-up. I think Mike may have sent this out already, but here's our guide of how to get started. Things you can do to start setting an example and how you listen, public declarations you can make, infrastructure commitments, even if you're a smaller city, smaller town and village. I want to really emphasize that. We're doing work in a lot of small villages and towns across this country, so it's not just big cities where this is playing out. And even how you're looking at things you could do to change certain policies and systems now. You don't have to wait to go through something comprehensive. What are things you could do now? And how do you start to commit to developing plans and putting in place? So there are things you could do to get started. We have, the other thing I want to encourage you to do that could be helpful is to look at some of the profiles that we have put up that shows how cities are organizing. As you can see, different size cities, different parts of the country, that it gives you a sense of what organizing looks like. As I mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all. And even as we highlight these cities have not figured it out. So I also want to be very clear about that. We're not lifting them up as the models as they've solved racial equity. But what we do hope it gives you is a sense of how you can get organized. What are some common themes? And that's where we started to see some common themes of what organizing looks like. What is the infrastructure, the core teams you're building? What's some of the interdepartmental teams that need to happen? Accountability agreements, work plans, performance reviews. There's lots of some common themes that get modified that we work with cities as you're trying to get organized and trying to figure out what that looks like. And so I hope you didn't feel rushed by this, but I do want to make sure I gave you that full. I promised to give you this as I started, right? The full kind of comprehensive space of this. And so I want to end in this space, which is, while I said a whole lot, and I know we're in this moment where I started with the video acknowledging the moment we're in, I'm also very mindful that people have different starting points in this work. I've seen in the last 6 years, some people are heart people, they feel it, and they're driven by the heart and the feeling and the emotion. Others are head people. They want to logically kind of understand it. And I'm also mindful in doing this work that you have 4 kinds of folks doing this. I organize them into 4 groups. You got the folks that are the advocates. They might be active advocates, but they're out there as leaders willing to talk about the issues. You got the ones that are followers, that they care, they're going to show up as you talk about it, they will be there, they'll be your supporters. They could be active supporters, followers, or passive followers. Then you have folks that are skeptical. People like, I'm not sure where you're going with this. They could be positive skeptical, they could be negative skeptical, but they're skeptical. And we got a lot of folks in the skeptical group. And then you have folks that are resistors. They could be active resistors or passive resistors, but they're just going to resist regardless of what you do. That exists in the work. All those 4 groups exist in the city work that we do on the ground. And it's really important to recognize that that will be a part of the work. And what's your strategy to help those advocates that are advocates be more effective as advocates? Is there a strategy that you can do to help people that are followers become advocates? Maybe there's work that they can do. They stop just following, but they start to use their platform and do something more. And people that are skeptical, maybe they're open to hearing why they could become followers. And so what can you do to help them become followers in that space? And the folks that are resistors, they will always resist probably. But is there ways to make them less resisting? Is there ways for them not to be as active in their resistance? And there's strategies for that. There are tools actually in terms of, obviously I'm not going to spend time about how do you help people become less resisting, because you have at least affirmed who they are. You've affirmed their humanity. You've acknowledged where they are resisting and why they're resisting. And there's work to do even in how you affirm each other in this work. And so I acknowledge that as I end, because when we talk about racial equity, it's not just in the heart space. Racial equity is good governance. For those that want to understand why are you taking on racial equity, it's good governance. We know that if we center racial equity, as a city will be more prosperous, will be healthier, will be safer, our government will be more accountable. We also know just financially that we will be more prosperous as a city. And so there is a resource I encourage you to check out. It's called nationalequityatlas.org. I put in just the state of Oregon because I was coming to cities in the state of Oregon, and there's a lot of data on what the economy would look like if you centered equity. And so one of the data points I pulled out is how much larger the economy would be if there were no racial gaps in income in the state of Oregon. And so the economy would be almost $15 billion larger. Right? That, for me, as you start making the business case for racial equity, is not a heart space. That's a head space for some people who want to know bottom line, kind of why we need to be doing this and why we need to prioritize this. So I really appreciate you guys listening and taking, hopefully this has been helpful. I started with a quote with the late Dr. Maya Angelou. I want to end with this quote from Angela Davis, which is, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. I'll leave my contact information here as well, so if you guys wanted to reach out to me. And I'm happy to stop my screening share so we can all see each other, see if there are any questions.